Now, I am tired of the white tears. You are competent. You are not concerned. So the only people that are crying are the mediocre white boys.
This congresswoman just went on one of the nastiest rants I've ever heard, and the Democratic Party is cheering her on. We're going to break all this down and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where we take on the craziest ideas from across our media, our politics, and the internet, all from an independent perspective. Up first, guys, I really wasn't expecting to be talking about Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic congresswoman from Texas, to be talking about her again so soon after we just covered her the other day, but she just gave one of the most shocking and unhinged television interviews I think I've ever seen a politician give. And rather than condemn her insane and hateful rant about white men, the Democratic Party, again appearing to have learned absolutely nothing, doubled down on it and echoed and embraced it. Before we even get to the nastiest part of the interview that Jasmine Crockett gave with Laura Coates Live over on CNN, I just want to fact check something she said that is not even close to being accurate. Take a listen.
We right now have a white supremacist that is sitting in the White House. He is backed up by other white supremacists. And if you really want to know who the criminals are in this country, you can Google it. You don't have to trust me. But the people that commit 80% of the most violent crimes in this country are white supremacists. Yet for whatever reason, they sit and they serve at the pleasure of the president. They are the ones that were there on January 6th, tearing our democracy down physically. And now we have them tearing us down right here from within. Here is the problem.
Of course, Congresswoman, to interrupt you, but President Trump, of course, has denied any allegations he's a white supremacist, and that's why he apparently fired what he is.
We're gonna need a fact check on aisle Jasmine. One, calling Donald Trump a white supremacist is pretty absurd. He's definitely said some racially insensitive things over the years, but his coalition expanded to include more minority voters this past time around. He's appointing people of all different races. Nothing that he's trying to do is about promoting white people over everyone else. You can criticize him, but that's a hysterical take. And two, the claim that she makes that white supremacists are responsible for 80% of violent crime in this country, I don't even know what she's talking about. I searched and tried to find any statistical basis for that claim, and it doesn't exist. White people commit about 50% of non-fatal violent crime and about 41% of homicides where the offender, so the killer's race, is known to police. Not 80%, and in fact, that's, if anything, slightly underrepresented relative to population levels. Like, I have no idea what she's talking about. And there's no proof that all those people, or even most of them, are white supremacists. Of course, there have been horrific attacks and atrocities committed by white supremacists, like Dylan Roof comes to mind and others, and those people deserve to rot in hell and are evil, but spreading hysterical fake statistics and alarmist narratives is not productive, to say the very least. Neither is where Congresswoman Crockett went next, which is one of the most unhinged rants insulting white men that I've seen, and coming not from some woke journalist or some TikToker, but a sitting member of Congress. She actually said this, and honestly, it left even the CNN host stunned.
The coddling is for the white boys. That's what's happening right now. I am tired of the white tears. Listen, if you are competent, you are not concerned. When I walk into Congress every single day, you know why I don't feel a way and why you can't make me doubt who I am? Is because I know that I had to work 10 times as hard as they did just to get into the seat. When you look and you compare me to Marjorie Taylor Greene or me to Lauren Boebert, there is no comparison. And that is the life that we have always lived. So the only people that are crying are the mediocre white boys that have been beaten out by people that historically have had to work so much harder.
So for me, the funniest part of that clip is that there's actually quite a good comparison between Jasmine Crockett and Marjorie Taylor Greene, because Marjorie Taylor Greene is a crazy person and kind of clownish on the far right side, and Jasmine Crockett is exactly that on the far left side. But to be clear, what she just said is so toxic and also so totally wrong and just makes absolutely no sense, either politically, just in terms of strategy, but also not on its merits. Like, what is she talking about? That only incompetent white boys are upset about DEI practices that discriminate against them. No, Jasmine. Part of the problem is that competent people feel hard done by because the criteria to evaluate people aren't meritocratic. I mean, we covered so many examples of this on this show just in the last few months, from Disney admitting on hidden recordings that they won't hire white people, white men for certain roles, to the University of Colorado being caught openly saying they're only going to hire certain races for new jobs, to things like affirmative action, where people were treated totally differently if they had the same scores and grades but different skin colors. The point is that people are upset because they're not being evaluated on their merit. So not just incompetent people are mad, competent people are screwed over by these policies in both directions. Both, people who aren't part of a marginalized group who then don't get an opportunity because they're lifting the scales artificially, putting their thumb on the scales to jerry-rig diverse outcomes. But also, the big losers here are competent minorities, women, people of color, what it may be, who do deserve to get into that school, to get that job on their merits. But because of this system that privileges people in their groups artificially sometimes, they're then unfairly viewed as DEI hires or diversity hires in a way that's not fair to them because they are qualified. So they're losers too. And that's why a lot of this stuff is actually increasingly unpopular with minorities themselves. And just the callous way that this congresswoman is speaking about white men and white people and how she doesn't care, she's sick of white tears and she's sick of these mediocre white boys. It's like very racially hostile and inflammatory. And you would never get away with it in the opposite direction. I wouldn't do this because it's such a classless and toxic way to speak. But imagine if I went on CNN and I said about, the people upset about ending DEI practices in the federal government, I'm sick of the black tears and these incompetent black women who are sobbing because they can't get handouts and special treatment anymore. They jump down my throat on that, and to some extent fairly so, because it's a very divisive and inflammatory way to speak, and that's why I would never say it like that. That's never how I would choose to present myself. But you have a total double standard here, because not only was she not checked by the CNN host here, Laura Coates, the entire Democratic Party apparatus celebrated her dunking on mediocre white men and their white tears. The official rapid response page of the Democratic Party, called Fact Post, narrator, they do not only post facts, shared Jasmine Crockett's clip from CNN, quoting her, "If you are competent, you are not concerned. The only people crying are mediocre white boys." So condemning people who have any concerns about DEI and the unfair treatment it sometimes entails as just mediocre white boys who are crying their white tears is not just something one fringe extreme congresswoman said, but it's a message that the Democratic Party in its official apparatus doubles down on, endorses, and amplifies. That is disgraceful. That is unhinged. And again, we come back to this theme in our recent coverage. It shows they are learning absolutely nothing and that they actively seem to want Donald Trump Jr. 2028 or JD Vance 2028, because this is how you got Trump, and it's how you'll get more Trump or more Trumpism. I do want to point out that some sensible left-of-center commentators and journalists pushed back on the Democratic Party for embracing this toxic rhetoric. My friend Brianna Wu wrote, "This is flat out embarrassing and makes Democrats unelectable. I'm no longer going to support any ideology that treats parts of the country as disposable and inherently evil." Look, if they were listening to Brianna, who was a Democratic strategist, and not listening to like woke 20-somethings who think this stuff is amazing, the Democrats might have much better chances politically. Pollster Frank Luntz pointed out that this type of language is popular in progressive circles, but is toxic waste to voters outside of that. Congresswoman Crockett won her House seat by nearly 70% last year, so she won't see any electoral consequences, but other Dems might if this language becomes trendy with their base. I mean, this is absolutely true. People like this who are in super deep blue or super deep red seats, they can be extreme. In fact, they're incentivized to do so, but it actually hurts the members of their parties who actually have to win contested elections, because if Republicans were smart, when the midterms roll around, they would clip this up and then clip it with news stories about DEI being unfair to competent and qualified people. And then they'd frame Republicans as against this and Democrats as just disdainful and think you're just mediocre white boys. And that, I can tell you now, would be a very effective political ad campaign, gifted to the Republicans by this woman, Jasmine Crockett, who just seems desperate for attention and is willing to say things that are totally inflammatory and divisive and harmful to her side and just immoral and evil to get it. Congresswoman Crockett just also seems very divorced from facts and reality, like she was in another part of this interview.
This is why they don't want us to have education. This is why they are trying to literally say we won't fund the HBCUs, because they know that if they've already gone after affirmative action and they're saying, you know what, don't allow them to come into, say, these PWIs, as we call them, don't allow them to come into these institutions. We know why they created the HBCUs in the first place. It was because they wouldn't allow us into the white institutions. And so now they're not allowing us in. And now they're saying, you know what, we're also going to defund the HBCUs. You know why? Because they don't want any more Kamala Harrises. They don't want any more Jasmine Crockett's. But I got news for them. I don't care what they do. We will fight to the end to make sure that we get our due. Because again, if you want to talk about the people that shouldn't be in this country, you probably need to look in the mirror, because the last time I checked, the Native Americans who some of ICE have been rounding up, or the Puerto Ricans who are absolutely Americans, listen, the only people that came and colonized this place are your ancestors, Trump.
Oh my God. There's so much there. So much false information and so many absurd arguments. But for one thing, for example, did she really just suggest that all white people in the country today don't belong here and really shouldn't be here? Kind of a psychotic take for a sitting member of our government who swore an oath to defend our country, apparently thinks it's illegitimate and evil and none of us should be here. And also, what she's talking about is not true. No Native American people have been deported or put into camps. A few indigenous people who've been caught up in ICE raids of different places of employment where a lot of undocumented workers have been asked to show their paperwork or their citizenship, and that's unfortunate, but I don't really think it's the end of the world. And it's kind of inevitable when you're going to deport large numbers of people, which Barack Obama also did, and I'm sure some other people were caught up in it. And then Congresswoman Crockett is just lying again. Donald Trump doesn't want to cut HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities like Howard and other institutions like this. In fact, he was applauded in his first term as president by some HBCU leaders for securing them significant funding. And she makes it sound like black people can't get into college without affirmative action. They can't get into non-HBCUs, so just everyday public colleges or private colleges that are, race neutral after the end of affirmative action. That's so not true. And I can't speak on behalf of black people, obviously, but to me, that seems very belittling and demeaning to them, suggesting that if they're just treated equally and if there's no kind of thumb on the scales, then black people can't get education or they don't want us to have access to education. That's not it at all. We want them to have access to education, just like everyone else. We just want it to be fair and no racial preferences for or against any group. And she's acting like that makes us evil white supremacists or something. This woman is really, really extreme and toxic. And what's so funny about this is the segment, because I saw this little snippet of Jasmine Crockett where she talks about the mediocre white boys going viral on X. And I always want to try to get back to the source and find what's the full segment. And then I go and watch it. So I watched the full thing that most people are just showing you that little soundbite. I watched the full segment and clipped up other parts that they missed. But I also saw kind of the buildup and the context. And the context of this conversation was actually something that should be an easy win for Democrats, she turned into this toxic, unhinged rant. So the setup of the story was that the Trump administration has made a guy named Darren Beattie, who is a very controversial figure, they've appointed him to a position at the State Department under Marco Rubio. And this is a really extreme person with tons of fringe views.
President Trump is appointing Darren Beattie to a top State Department role. I know many people remember who Darren Beattie is. He was fired in 2018 from being a speechwriter. He was speaking at a conference attended by white nationalists. And then a few months ago, he posted this, Congresswoman: competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. Unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on coddling the feelings of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men.
Including tweeting in 2024 that competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work, which is obviously kind of crazy and racist. Competent people must be in charge if you want things to work. They don't have to be white and they don't always have to be men. That's just one of so many unhinged takes this dude has. He's weirdly pro-China and pro-CCP, pro-Communist Party. It's a very strange dude, and I think CNN and Democrats are totally right to raise the alarm and be like, why is the Trump administration appointing this crazy person? But Congresswoman Crockett had to take this layup and turn it into a massive own goal. Mixing of the sports metaphors there. Not great. But anyway, to me, it just shows like the toxic trap of identity politics. They can't help themselves, even though they're destroying their own political side of the aisle and turning off millions of otherwise gettable voters and Americans in the process. Other than that, though, Congresswoman Crockett, you're doing amazing, sweetie. What do you guys think? What did you think of this unhinged CNN segment and this interview with the Congresswoman? Let me know in the comments below. Do hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. By the way, guys, before we get into our next segment, I do have an announcement. I did just drop a new merch line. So to get your Delulu is Showing mug or long sleeve or other cool products, check out the link in the description or the products embedded into this video. Up next, do Democrats just need to be meaner and more insulting to Americans who disagree with them? That's the argument made by one increasingly popular TikTok influencer whose whole shtick is to insult and belittle Republican women based on their appearance and makeup.
Hey, I noticed that all of the Republican girlies in my comments do their makeup the exact same gorgeous way, so I thought that I would try to do it myself. We really want our makeup to cling to any dry spots and accentuate any texture that we might have. You want to choose a makeup that doesn't match the undertones of our skin. I also applied extra tanner to my hands so that it doesn't actually match. It's giving drained, it's giving dusty. We want to make sure that it doesn't look like we've ever used moisturizer once in our life. I try not to look so jaundiced, me personally. Zigzag part in her hair is also certainly a choice. I actually had the same one in my 5th grade school photo. Finally, maybe next time don't use the Grinch as your lip flip inspo. At least go for Martha May Whovier. That would be a massive step up. Oh no, am I being mean to the people who want to erase my trans friends from existing on this earth? Am I being mean to the people who are foaming at the mouth to say the N-word so instead they just say DEI? Good. Perfect. And I assure you, I sleep so well at night. You can check my Oura Ring score, knowing I'm doing everything I can to speak out against these people. I sleep with a fan on medium, humidifier on high, and a face oil to lock in the moisture. They should try it.
This woman's name is Suzanne Lambert, and she styles herself as a liberal Regina George, like from Mean Girls. And she basically just insults Republicans on TikTok and is becoming very popular for it, even though she's like very divisive and very toxic and kind of doing the opposite of convincing people. She's doing fan service for Democrats and resistance liberal types who like to see Republicans belittled, but independents or Republicans who see her content are almost certainly made to feel defensive and attacked, not convinced or persuaded. So if you're a Democrat and you want to convince Democrats, you really should be against this approach, just as a kind of a basic logical strategy. But the mainstream media, with its liberal bias, is cheering her on. We're going to take a look at a package that CBS News did basically uncritically promoting this woman's work, even though she's one of the most toxic woke people on the internet. Here's the first clip from her interview.
Not all of us were meant to be Michelle Obama, Jack Schlossberg liberals. Some of us were meant to be Regina George liberals. Y'all did it your way, and we're doing it our way.
Regina George liberals. That was viral TikTok influencer Suzanne Lambert explaining and defending her growing celebrity as a, quote, this is the quote, mean Democrat. Lambert has built a following, you should know, of more than 500,000 on TikTok. Her videos have been viewed millions of times and significantly garnered more than 10 million likes. Here is one of her most popular, where she mocks Republicans who criticize her, and she does it through kind of a makeup tutorial.
Rather than using a brush, we're actually just gonna apply directly to the skin and use our hands. That way it's streaky and it doesn't blend well. Now I've got my driest mascara that I'm just gonna kind of make sure you get a little on the eyelids too, and don't clean it up, just for the full effect.
So as you can see from the package presented to introduce this woman, they're not like taking a critical look at this new online voice. They're just uplifting her. Like, look at this amazing influencer and this great work she's doing, calling Republican women ugly over and over again and making fun of them and insulting them and making them feel defensive. This is great. This is totally going to improve the quality of our public discourse and really help foster healthy political conversations across the divide. Like, what? How is this supposedly neutral host just like uncritically parroting and promoting this? And you'll see that he does not ask her any tough questions or push back on her really to any significant extent in this full segment. Here's a second clip.
And when you say Regina George liberal, what do you mean? Or Democrat?
So, I love Mean Girls, of course. And Regina George, she has a lot of flaws. She's not a perfect character. Right. We're all flawed, right? But one thing that Regina is really good at, she's good at organizing. She's good at garnering attention. She hits back. She sticks up for herself, and that's something that we haven't seen historically from Democrats, from other liberals. And after the election, all the messaging was around how we're going to get through this with love and peace and kindness. And sure, those things are true, but I was like, I can't do another 4 years of this, especially given everything they're doing.
You're a little low on the peace and joy part, right?
I mean, yeah, and I think, too, that there is a lot of love in fiercely advocating for people and policies, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, guys, when she insults people's looks and makes fun of them, she's just showing love in advocating for people, bro. No, if you actually cared about the causes you say you care about, from immigration to trans issues or whatever, you would be trying to cross the divide and convince people, because we live in a society where we have democratic governance, representative governance through a democracy and a democratic system. You have to convince your neighbors if you want to achieve your political goals, not insult and belittle and demean them. That might get you internet clout. It might make you money from the TikTok Creator Fund, but it does not help your side or make our country a better place. I mean, she really does seem to believe in a very toxic, very eye for an eye type of approach to politics and discourse. Take a listen.
Point, does ferocity need to be met with ferocity?
I would say so. I mean, people will be like, you shouldn't fight fire with fire. I'm like, well, I'm not a firefighter. You don't want me fighting fires. I put aluminum foil in the microwave, like, fairly recently, right? I'm not in charge of fire response.
That didn't work out well, I'm gathering.
No, it didn't. Funny thing about that. But I would also say you don't fight fire with a little drippy water hose. You fight fire with equal exertion of force, and I think that we need to do that.
And you've talked in your videos about comments like, oh, don't be so harsh, don't be so piercing, don't be so judgmental. And your reply is, in general?
In general, I mean, men do it all the time, right? Look at Steve Colbert. Look at Jon Stewart. They've been doing this, right? Humor has been a cornerstone of politics for the entirety of our history, but typically you see it coming from men. And you don't see people in Jon Stewart's comments telling him to be nice. Right. You're so mean. They might say other things.
Guys get a free pass.
Yeah. I mean, to an extent, yeah, they don't tell them to be nice. So when it's a woman doing it, people are like, whoa, 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 this is really mean. And I'm like, yeah, that's the point.
So neither other people do it too, or eye for an eye are good or valid moral arguments in defense of insulting and bullying people because they disagree with you. The first one, I don't know that these male comedians she named, really, they don't go after people's looks with the regularity and ferocity that this woman does. To be clear, I don't think. They're also a lot funnier than her. Though a couple of her videos have been humorous, I will admit. But if she was coming from a more like jokey place or kind of playful, making fun of people, and less of like a genuinely nasty, hateful place, I'd be able to find her a lot funnier. And then this eye for an eye approach is so crazy because when you fight fire with fire, you don't put out the fire. You don't save the country. You burn everything down. It just leads to escalation, like tit for tat and tit for tat. Like that's why the whole idea is supposed to be turn the other cheek. Don't sink to their level. Just because Trump calls people names or whatever, or because you think the other side is evil and mean, doesn't mean you should be that in reverse. Because then not only are you starting this escalation that's going to take us to a worse place, you're also becoming the thing you say you hate and you're supposed to be against, which then how are you better exactly? How are you different? It really just represents to me everything that's wrong with discourse online, because she's able to build a brand for herself, make herself money and get herself attention by catering to extreme liberals, fomenting their hatred of the other side while actively like putting off and discouraging people from the opposite side to interact or hear from their perspective, and making her own cause less popular, but aggrandizing herself and supporting her own budding career as an influencer and making money while actively making everything worse. It's like, rare do I come across an influencer who so perfectly embodies the opposite of what I hope to do in this space. And again, why is mainstream media cheering her and uplifting her like she's some kind of cool or heroic figure? If anything, I'm not against interviewing people. I would interview this woman if I hosted a television show, but I would ask her pointed questions. I would push back on her. I would ask her all of these things I'm talking about now. I wouldn't softball and promote toxic people who are making the discourse worse. Like, ask yourself this. Would CBS News ever have a Republican troll, a Republican TikTok troll who just makes fun of how non-binary people look on the internet? And those accounts exist. And occasionally they are funny. But would CBS News ever do a full segment uncritically promoting those people and saying like, look at you, oh, you're having this big impact. You're like the new Regina George. No, they would not. And we know why. But if mainstream media didn't have double standards, they really wouldn't have any standards at all. What do you guys think? Are you a fan of this woman's content? Do you think influencers like her are making the world a better place? I do want to hear from you, so let me know in the comments down below, and do hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. One final thing for today's show. LGBT activists are up in arms because President Trump just signed an executive order attempting to enforce sex segregation along biological lines in women's sports nationwide. Here's some news coverage.
Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. From now on, women's sports will be only for women. And we're putting every school receiving taxpayer dollars on notice that if you let men take over women's sports teams or invade your locker rooms, you will be investigated for violations of Title IX and risk your federal funding. Because with this executive order, the war on women's sports is over.
President Trump making good on his promise, signing an executive order keeping biological men out of women's sports.
It's pretty simple. He's saying that they want women's sports to be segregated by sex, not identity. So trans women can't compete in women's sports because biologically they are male. Trump is attempting to enforce this under Title IX, which is a law that requires educational institutions from the K-12 level to the collegiate level that receive federal funds to offer women equal opportunity to participate in sports. Their argument is that if the women's division is open to males, then women aren't being offered equal opportunity. They'll be sued in court on the legal rationale there and whether they can really implement this policy via executive order. But I've always supported this position more broadly, and I think it's just common sense that biology is what matters when it comes to sports, not identity. And women's sports exist as a separate entity for a reason, because there are important biological differences that don't fully go away. They are definitely reduced when you take estrogen or have the hormone replacement therapy, but they don't fully go away. And that's why we've seen some high-profile examples of trans athletes injuring women or winning competitions. It's not the most common thing in the world, but it strikes most people, including people who are not all hateful bigots, as fundamentally unfair and wrong. So this is a massive win for Trump. It's such an issue where he looks like simultaneously the traditionalists are happy, but also a lot of like feminists are happy, and just most common sense people agree with what he's doing. Then there's the Wi-Fi password movement, where many of the activists are very unhappy about this. Here are some LGBT activists who spoke to CBS News New York.
Today, I'm feeling just deeply disappointed.
Emotions of anger and disappointment echoing across the LGBTQ community Wednesday.
Instead of addressing real issues facing Americans, Trump is once again targeting the transgender community simply to score political points.
There's a lot of confusion, a lot of fear amongst trans people.
Chris Mosier is an accomplished and record-setting Nike-sponsored transgender athlete who says he's shocked but not surprised.
We are banding together to fight along with other groups, and we will continue to fight. We will continue to stand in our power, and no matter what, we will continue to exist.
So this was interesting to me because nobody said that you don't exist or that you need to stop existing. That's not a thing. We all know you exist. Trans people absolutely exist and have every right to, like anybody else. But people who are biologically male don't have a right to participate in women's sports. I'm not allowed to participate in women's sports. When I was in high school, I played on the male soccer team, not the girls soccer team, and I wasn't allowed, right? And that's not a violation of my rights. It's that it is upheld in federal law and actually required that there is a male's division and a female division. And those distinctions exist for a reason. I just don't think that acknowledging science and biological reality is inherently hateful or violates anyone's rights. You'll see sometimes headlines and claims that like Republicans are banning trans people from playing sports. That is not true. Importantly, trans boys are, from what I can tell from this executive order, still allowed to play in the boys' sports because they're only putting themselves at a disadvantage. So I've always been fine with that because they're biologically female, but they're playing with the boys. So they're at a disadvantage. They don't have an advantage. And then trans girls who are biologically male can still play sports. They just have to play in the male division, which I certainly acknowledge is uncomfortable for them and not ideal for them. And I do have some compassion and empathy for their situation. But I guess that's part of what you give up when you decide to transition. And you can't just jeopardize and compromise women's sports as an institution by eroding the important and necessary sex separation. Meanwhile, on TikTok, I keep seeing this talking point about how this is a total non-issue.
Trump just banned trans women from competing in sports. That'll show all 15 of them.
Now, part of the argument they're making here is that there aren't very many trans athletes, and they use data from the college level, the collegiate level, where, to be fair, there aren't a ton of trans women athletes. There's several dozen, though some of them are very high profile, like Leah Thomas, in ways that clearly were unfair and made other people uncomfortable. But we're not just talking about the collegiate level here. We're also talking about the high school level and elsewhere, and so it's a lot bigger than that. It's not just 10 people or 30 people or whatever they keep saying. That is a dishonest and inaccurate framing. And regardless, it's just about the principle of it. It's not fair. And it's important to reaffirm and restate biological reality. But the left-wing commentariat really lost it over this development. The Majority Report co-host Emma Vigeland shared the news that Trump signed this executive order and said, let's recreate the Tim Walz photo op, but instead of feeding children in school, how about we drive some trans kids to suicide? Wow, that is an unhinged statement. There is absolutely no evidence that sports participation rules affect suicide rates in transgender youth. There's not even evidence that medically transitioning, these treatments they say are life-saving and necessary, there's not even quality evidence of any kind showing that that reduces, let alone what sports teams people can play on. So this is a really alarmist and hysterical thing, and you should not, journalists and commentators should not be talking about mental health and self-harm in these kinds of flippant and extreme ways. It's actually very bad to do that. And journalistic ethics and standards require a degree of nuance and a lack of hyperbole when you talk about such serious issues related to mental health. Notice also how, from this perspective, there's no thought given to the female athletes who lose out on opportunities or scholarships or are made to feel uncomfortable in their locker rooms by the presence of male genitalia or anything like that. No thought for how it might affect them. Just hysterical, unfounded claims about how it will affect trans kids. That really summed it up for me right there. A trans activist named Caitlin Burns also wrote about this revelation. Losing on this issue feels like my life's biggest failure. My words and scientific reality could not overcome a century of bigotry and false assumptions about trans bodies. Bruh. I know I'm supposed to be in the same community as these people, but I don't even think I'm in the same reality. Like, Caitlin, respectfully, the reason you lost on this issue and lost so hard is because you are on the opposite side of scientific reality. You're on the side that says biological sex isn't real and doesn't have meaningful differences that affect things like sports. We're on the side that is in line with scientific reality and basic biology. I just don't know how to reach these people. But frankly, while activists on the internet melted down over this news, almost all Americans support this, at least in broad strokes. Listen to CNN, yes, CNN, acknowledging that, because their own polling found almost 80% of the country agrees with, in general, limiting female sports to females.
I think these numbers are really illuminating on this topic because I just think there's such a clear trend among the American public. So transgender female athletes in women's sports, only 18% of the country says that they should be, in fact, allowed to participate in women's sports. Compare this to the opposition. I mean, my goodness gracious, 79%. You rarely get 79% of the country to agree on anything, but they do, in fact, agree on the idea of opposing transgender female athletes in women's sports. But it's not just the here and now, Laura. It's not just the here and now. What we're actually seeing is a trend on this particular issue, and it's going in the direction of opposition. So take a look here. Okay, transgendered female athletes, and amongst those Americans who oppose them in women's sports, back in 2021, it was 62%. A majority, but, you know, not anywhere close to a ginormous majority, right? A clear majority, but not a ginormous majority. But then again, you look here in 2025, you see it at 79%. So it's not just that the majority of Americans are opposed to transgender female athletes in women's sports. It's that the opposition has become considerably larger in just the last 4 years.
Guys, this support is so extreme, there's literally no spin to be put on it. Even CNN just has to acknowledge, like, basically no one supports this radical progressive idea except the 18%. And people were asking, like, who is this 18%? I've never met them, because even a majority of Democrats, everyday Democrats, disagree with this. It's the woke people, the activists, the journalists, the San Francisco city dwellers of the world, the kinds of people whose TikToks and tweets I've been reading you. So just in broad strokes, I have to say that I think this move towards acknowledging biological reality and protecting female sports is a good thing. It's a common sense development. The specifics of the executive order and the way that Trump speaks about it are not necessarily how I would do this. Especially just doing all this via executive order does have significant drawbacks, because what can be done via executive order can be undone via executive order. One woman wrote on Twitter about Trump signing the executive order, "This is great and all, but 4 years from now, a Democratic president could be signing an EO revoking every single Trump executive order. All these wins are temporary until you can pass actual laws." This is true. If you live by executive order, you die by executive order. Not only could President Kamala Harris 2028, or God forbid, President AOC or President Jasmine Crockett, not only could they revoke Trump's order and undo this rule, they could potentially try to do the same thing in the opposite direction and require schools and collegiate athletics and other things to allow trans women, citing Title IX. And because there's no actual law clarifying this that's passed by Congress, signed by a president, and set into law, very hard to change, they might even be able to get away with that. That's why I'd really strongly prefer to see them actually pass a law. And are there really not enough people in Congress from both parties who'd be willing to join such a common sense type of thing? Maybe not. I don't know, but I do just want to add that context for you guys that what's done by executive fiat like this can be easily undone. So it's a win, but it's potentially a fleeting one. That's just my take. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Do hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. All right, everybody. That's it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk again real soon.